Good evening, everybody. First of all, let me thank Divadlo na Hradě for the great job. I don't know if you ever performed on stage. It's pretty hard to do a show in your own language, let alone in a language which is not your own. And I think that they managed to do really well. It was a great show, and thank you so much for that. I also would like to thank Marta Smolíková and Václav Havel Library to invite me to chair this session today, the discussion here today, because it's a great honor for me to be here with Dr. Barbara Day, who did so much for Czech theater, not only for Czech theater and the representation of Czech culture abroad. There's not that many people who did so much for Czech theater. And I prepared a very short bio. Barbara Day would deserve way longer, but I think that she told me that I should shorten this one, but I said no. So let me please just read this. I'll carry on with the stage reading we just had here. Barbara Day studied theater in Manchester and in Prague in the 1960s, and in 1980 returned to Bristol University to write her PhD dissertation on the theater on the Balustrades of Prague and the small stage tradition in Czechoslovakia. Whilst completing her dissertation, she began working for the Oxford-based Jan Hus Educational Foundation, which supported the underground university in Czechoslovakia. After 1989, she helped her Czech and Slovak colleagues establish the Jan Hus Foundation in the Czech and Slovak republics, leaving in 1996 to write The Velvet Philosophers, a book published in the UK and the Czech Republic at the same time in 1999 in English and in Czech, and in Hungary in 2004. In 1997, she was a co-founder of the Prague Society for International Cooperation. She also translates from Czech to English in the fields of art, architecture, music, film, history, and theater. So this is just to start. And when we were preparing this discussion with Barbara, and it's going to be an open discussion, we're hoping that you're going to have questions, and Barbara is definitely prepared to answer it. Me too, if I may. So when we're talking about this discussion here today, we thought that it might be quite useful for us to open it with a rather wider contextual topic. As I mentioned in the introductory note, Barbara came here 10 years before the play you just saw today. It was written in 1975. Barbara came here 10 years before that, in 1965. So she came into a very interesting period of our modern Czech history, in the middle of what we call golden 60s. It was a time of great cultural upsurge, cultural, social, political. And when she got here, she was able to see 3 original shows of Václav Havel's plays at the theater on the Balustrade. And I think it's quite important for a foreigner, even for a Czech person. I wasn't able to see that because I wasn't born yet. To understand Václav Havel in this context, because these shows were written for theater on the Balustrade. Václav Havel was a dramaturg of that theater as well as a technician. And he wrote these plays for that particular theater, for those particular actors and directors. First, Garden Party, Otomar Krejča, one of the leading directors of the 20th century here in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic. You came here to Czechoslovakia, I said probably Czech Republic, I'm biased. You saw Memorandum here in 1965, directed by Jan Grossman, another leading figure of Czech theater history. And then you saw in 1968 the increased difficulty of concentration, directed by Hudeček. So do you think we can start from there, in the middle of 1960s, and your experiences?
Yes, I'm going to go back to what it was like just to arrive here as a student, probably the same age as a lot of you who are here tonight, and knowing really nothing except that I wanted to see this country. And I had the experience of going to the Drama Academy to Damel, and the secretary was there sitting saying, "Oh, we don't know what we're going to do with you. You don't speak Czech. You're only here for a year. What use are you?" And they sent me out to rehearsals in one of the suburban theatres. And I diligently went to those rehearsals every morning at 10 o'clock, listened to the director explaining everything in Czech. But somehow the atmosphere in Prague, it was a very open time. It was a time when people were willing to meet you. If I'd come a few years earlier, probably I'd have had a lot of trouble getting any further than that. But within a few weeks, I had met people who were working at the theatre on the Balustrades, which was one of the most exciting theatres at that time. By the beginning of the new year, I was watching young Grossman's rehearsals of the trial. And that was when I began to see these plays by this exciting young dramatist. Václav Havel was still under 30, but he was already making a name for himself. And the atmosphere was so incredibly intense. Even with only just beginning to learn the language, I could feel what was going on. And people were very open, willing to explain things to me. And at that time, Havel's plays had just been translated into English, but they hadn't been published. So he was about the only person who had copies of the English translations. And he lent those to me so that I could read the translation and see the play. And probably a lot of you know the theatre on the Balustrades. It's very, very tiny and very small audiences, but incredible atmosphere in them.
Was it hard for you as a foreigner to, because one thing is that you were able to read the plays in your own language before you studied Czech or learned Czech. Was it hard for you to understand it, because you had theatre of the absurd in England? You were familiar with Harold Pinter and Samuel Beckett, all these playwrights. Is there any difference for you as a foreigner to understand?
Well, I should say that as part of Jan Grossman's dramaturgy at the theatre, besides Havel, he was doing his own adaptations of Alfred Jarry, Ubu and Kafka's Trial, and he wasn't actually directing them himself, but he chose them for the repertoire, UNESCO and Beckett, Waiting for Godot. So the Czech audiences were seeing these plays for the first time quite a lot later than they'd seen them in the West. And there were just round about 1966, between 66 and 68, there were people like Peter Brook, Ken Tynan, Martin Esslin, also coming to see them. And I think it was one of those who said, you know, what is absurd theatre in the West is real life behind the Iron Curtain. So you could even say that these plays were not theatre of the absurd because they were very realistic.
That's right. Václav Havel himself didn't really like that. Well, none of them liked the term playwright of the absurd, or a representative of the theatre of the absurd. But he called his theatre of paradoxes rather than theatre of the absurd. But I'm asking that because looking at this program here, For foreigners, it's hard to probably understand certain things which are being part of that play. Names, the location, why this is happening here. And the point is, or my question is, how transferable or adaptable are these plays for foreign audiences? Do they have to be related? Because my experience is when I teach about Václav Havel, we read Largo Desolata or Vernissage or Audience, is that they always tend to relate the text by Václav Havel to the time and space for which in which it was written. Do you think it's important to situate it back to historical context, or do you think there are certain universal topics which are not confined by this time and space, totalitarian regime, etc.?
I think it's always fair to try a different way, to experiment. It may not work, but you won't know until you find out. In the translations, I remember the first translation of the increased difficulty of concentration translated the Beskidi Mountains as the Dolomites and the Yeseniki as the Alps. And I thought, no, that doesn't work because it creates different expectations. But, oh, well, there's so much to this question, because it's very difficult for foreign audiences, I think. If you're putting on a play like this, I've seen them in Bristol, in London, to convey, and probably it is now that that period is over, to convey what it was really like under a totalitarian regime. The kind of experience that we saw on stage here. And I remember when Largo Desolata was performed in Bristol, the translation was Tom Stoppard, or he adapted the literal translation. And he noted that going to see the play, and the actors had noticed it as well, the audience were very unpredictable. You didn't know from night to night how they were going to react to something in the text. And he thought that it was something to do with the transferability, as you said. It's difficult, but then one can say that today is a different country as well.
That's right. I'm asking this question because you mentioned Largo Desolata, and that in the introductory note, Havel himself expressed his wish that he doesn't want his place to be confined by the time of totalitarian regime, the communist era, that he wants to have his place to be staged anywhere in the world for various audiences, not only for Czechs or Slovaks under totalitarian regime. But we can go to the show itself, to the audience or to the play, because it should be probably explained as well. It's part of a trilogy of Vaněk plays. We have audience, we've got Vernissage, Unveiling, it's also translated, and then we have Protest. And do you think that these three plays themselves, trilogy, Audience, Vernissage, are still topical? Are they still? Are they stageable? They are. We saw it. But yes. Do they still have something to say to contemporary audiences? And why?
My reaction is, well, it's not for me to say, it's for the audience to say.
That's right. We were part of the audience.
We were part of the audience, yes. Gosh, I know this place so well that I've seen it. It would be interesting to see the other two plays more often. I hope that this company will decide to do them. Because Vernissage, Unveiling, or opening the exhibition, it's got a theme that one can really see as being very contemporary, as being that of people who invest, but this is one of Havel's themes in other places as well. People who invest their energy, the things that they care about, in objects, where these objects replace actual human relations. And I think I'd like to see how that works with a modern audience. That particular play and Protest, I think I've only seen those audience, as I say, several times. But the other two plays, I've only seen them during their own time, during the time they were written.
Did you see the performance which was staged by Divadlo na Tahu, Andrej Krop's production back in the...
No, I didn't.
Actually, in that production, if I remember, I couldn't see it obviously again, but from the resources I have, in this show, they used 3 brewmasters actually. It was not played by one actor, but 3 actors.
So when he goes out...
Exactly, they kept switching, which again made this strange mechanism which occurs here probably more interesting.
Another thing about staging these plays, I think particularly in England, which I've noticed, is that they tend to look for the psychology of the characters. And I don't think it's that Havel was writing about. He was, to me, he was writing about attitudes, issues, things that can, I mean, when you said about the 3 actors taking the same role, things that can be exchanged rather than, I don't know, I mean, people in the audience may disagree entirely with me. But I saw Largo Desolato, in fact, at the same time in Bristol and in the Orange Tree in Richmond. And I felt in Richmond they got the essence of what the play was about. In Bristol they were trying to do it in a very naturalistic way.
And when you compare audience to Havel's other plays, the previous plays, do you see any difference there? And what difference you see? I mean, the plays I mentioned from the 1960s, The Garden Party, Memorandum, Increased Difficulty of Concentration.
I see them as part of the same line. They're plays where he wrote, where he knew who the actors were going to be. The first 3 plays, in some cases, he uses the actual actors' names for the roles. And again, the Vanier plays, he knew they would be performed by his friends. And that that they were going to be performed by people who understood what the play was about. And I think it seems to me that you get a much stronger point to them than in, say, a play like Conspirators, which he wrote, I think he may have written it in between. But was writing it for a stage that he didn't know if it existed or not. He didn't see any possibility of when it was going to be performed.
Do you see any common, let's say, topic which is encapsulated in these plays, which Havel followed? I think we talked about it. I think it's, for me, it's a topic, of course, of system and the collaboration with the system, and how one gets consumed by the system, even though a person is against it. And naturally, it just becomes a part of the system, like Banyek does.
I think I see that even in the plays that he wrote later, particularly Temptation. It's a theme he couldn't yes, I mean, you're right, we did talk about it, and it's so... The plays are so imbued with that it's something one can't avoid.
Maybe you might have some questions, so that it's not only a discussion of two people here. And as isolated from the audience, it's never good when we sit on stage, having an audience, a friend of us not paying attention to it. So, do you have any questions?
I'd be very glad if someone could, who's maybe seen one of these plays in another country, could give us their impressions, if there is anyone.
Or if you have any experience with Václav Havel as a playwright, you definitely know Václav Havel as a politician, president, etc. But he started probably, you know it, you might not know it, but he started as a reviewer back in the 1950s, a very young person. So there's a book right there on that table which collects his essays and extraordinary reviews. He wrote them in his early 20s, and at that time he was quite accomplished reviewer who was able to actually hit the essence to come up with a very accurate diagnosis of what he saw, and then he turned into a playwright, then dissident, and then president. So the question is probably if you know Václav Havel as a playwright, and if you know him from your own experience as readers or even as spectators. How we had a conference here in May, which basically tried to put together various scholars and practitioners and translators from all over the world. We had people from the States and from Japan and from Finland and from Italy, and we basically wanted to collect the knowledge which we can do here, because we're interested in the legacy of Václav Havel, playwright. Me as a theater scholar, definitely I'm interested in this topic. So that's basically the question here. If you have any experience with Václav Havel as an artist, as a playwright for theater.
Can I just bring in another element, because sure. I've just remembered it's one we didn't mention yet, and that is his use of humour, which is this reversal repetition, these circles he follows. And round about the 1960s, he wrote an essay called The Anatomy of the Gag.
That's right.
Where he works out what it is that creates this gag. I know Largo Desolato is one of your favourite plays.
That's right.
Can you remember what the first line is?
No. Not in English, definitely.
In Czech?
No, I don't remember. Seriously.
In Czech it's Konečně.
Konečně, that's
finally.
Right. Yes.
And his plays do work in this spiral. As we saw in Audience, where it ends with Vanier coming in again.
That's right. There's a question.
If you're talking about this look of reputation of the dialogues, of some particular dialogues are just repeating all the time in his plays. And some actions, like in, if I remember correctly, in Largo Desolato, the friend of the author, they will keep on asking him if he knows that they are worried about him, which at the end of the story you don't feel they are really worried about him. They are troublemakers for the author, basically, people around him. And I think somehow his peak points in his head, I mean in Václav Havel's head, showing up all the time in the play. Like the peak point repeats most of the time in his plays, like different plays, of course, different things are repeating. And this type of writing for Václav Havel is very unique to me. I've seen it again in other plays, but he has his own very unique way to how to repeat the information he wants to say. Well, sometimes it's a question for me, and maybe I don't get the whole thing, why this point exactly should be repeated all the time, but it's one of the attractive points of his plays to me.
Yes. Can you give me another example, because
for example, in this play, like we had the action of money coming in, there's action which is repeating, right? Like we have it at the beginning, we have it at the end. And there are some dialogues which are repeating all the time. Well, sometimes I personally don't get them, why that particular dialogue is repeating all the time. For example, he says, the brewery master is keep on asking him, are you married? Kids. So this is a dialogue which is repeating all the time. It's like a loop. It's like just all the time it's repeating, right? And he has it all the time in his plays, Václav Havel, which makes it interesting to me. Sometimes I get it, sometimes I feel it's a complication for me, I don't get it.
Excuse me for interrupting, I'm coming from an ex-communist country, from Romania, so I think the reason is why he's asking, you know, why actually, are you married, do you have kids? Because they didn't care. You know, this is, actually was written there 100 times, you know, this was, but they didn't care, so. Was like automatically asking, but nobody cared about the answer. That's not personal at all. I mean, this is from Romania. So was there. So probably I think here was similar.
I think also it's connected with the fact that he's interested in issues, in situations, in attitudes. So you don't necessarily get the naturalistic flow of dialogue that you would in a comedy written by someone in Britain. I'm sorry, names are disappearing from me. But you do get these situations recurring and seeing the different reactions. There was a question or an answer.
I just thought it was interesting what you brought up and your comment, because I actually understood it in a very different way. Like you were saying that they were questions where they didn't care. I actually understood that it was something that the brewmaster kind of wanted to touch upon. For example, asking about, do you have family, do you have kids? Because then he eventually wanted to share that he had kids. And he asked, are you feeling down, are you feeling down, are you feeling down? Because he's the one who's feeling down, we see later.
And he eventually finds out that he has 3 children. Yes.
So I don't know, it's kind of like you ask these questions because actually you want to share that information. I don't know.
Or there can be another answer. The guy who's getting more and more drunk and he keeps forgetting what's going on with it, really. There is certain motivation, you can find it. But the point is, I think, and Havel mentions it also in that introductory note for Larva Desolata, that he wants his plays to be understood as an abstract painting, as a conceptual art in a way, right? That there is something what is not easily decipherable, right? And it's like an installation in a way, right? When you have like contemporary art and it's just installed and it's just given to a disposal, and you as a spectator or as a reader, as a perceiver in general, have a very open field for creating your own thing out of it, right? So definitely he was, I think, very much interested in mechanisms of power. You can read it in his essays. He was interested in collaboration. He was interested in the system and how system swallows you. You can read it in this place, but he doesn't really give you a direct answer to this, because it would be pretty boring. It would be better to read his essays rather than his plays. That's what makes his plays different to his essays, I think.
At the same time, his memorandum.
Yes.
Ivana Zabragi was playing Ubu
Yeah.
and had an exhibition of pataphysical machines. And you realise that in memorandum, the office and the language are exactly those pataphysical
That's right.
machines.
Yeah, using Tidaba and...
Pataphysical machine, for anyone who hasn't met one yet. It exists, it's a very complicated structure which finally exists only to perpetuate itself.
Yes. Yes. And it's self-referential. It doesn't refer, like you have a sign, you have language, and we suppose language is supposed to represent something. And here language only represents itself. It actually swallows people. That's the ongoing topic again, right? That you are not using the language, language is using you. You become the victim of it, right? So these are the things, and it's basically this mechanism of a metaphysical machine which consumes you, absorbs you. You know, you think you're in control of it, you become more and more deeper in it, right? So I think this is quite an important mechanism, the repetition, that it doesn't refer to anything. It has basically no meaning. It's devoid of meaning. And once words have no meaning, well, what else do we have as human beings, right? And then there comes again the philosophy of Josef Schaffhausen, who was very important for Havel. He actually wrote an introductory note to his increased difficulty of concentration.
Tell us something about Schaffhausen.
Oh, yeah, he's a Brno-based philosopher, existentialist, who was hidden in his apartment for most of communist era. He had his own theater. We call it apartment theater here. And yeah, he was writing about. He actually wrote one very interesting essay on Denis Diderot and his actor's paradox. For him, it was a metaphor of a human being becoming a machine in a way, right? How you become a mechanism, just roughly speaking. And he was also influenced by Jan Potočka, phenomenologist, and I think Havel is in a way, in his plays and in his essays, a phenomenologist. He's just trying to interrogate what he's got, and he just tries to examine it as much, and it comes back. Right? When you examine something, you just.
So I'm not sure how many of the audience know about Potočka.
Oh yeah, it's a very important Czech philosopher, phenomenologist.
And also one of the first signatories of Charter 77.
That's right.
Like Havel.
That's right. So yeah, just starting with these repetitions, it's hard to say, right? And you have repetitions in Ionescu, but it's slightly different to here, right? It's not only a wordplay. There's, like Barbara said, there's something what is realistic behind it. We had once a discussion about Bulgakov's Master and Margaret, and the teacher was saying, like, when I was discussing with people who knew more about it than me, I said, yeah, it's mysterious. People are disappearing from the streets. But for them it was realistic. The car came, stopped. There was a person on the sidewalk. The car left. There was no person on the sidewalk. Right? They just kidnapped a person. So it seems mysterious from one point, but on the other, from a different perspective, from that local perspective, it's hyper-realistic examination of that real situation, just amplifying it.
Were Havel's themes political from the outset? Was he talking about politics from the beginning of his career? And then when I'm asking about politics, I don't mean party politics, I mean the mechanisms of politics and mechanisms of power. Was his favorite theme?
I think, using politics in that sense, it was an important theme because a lot of his plays are about manipulation, about using power, and there are I'm thinking particularly of the Memorandum, which is maybe my favourite play of them, where people find their way into positions of power simply by understating their situation. Would you agree?
Sure. Yeah, I would just add to it just one thing, that Havel, apart from his being a reviewer in the late 1950s, he started as an artist with poems. It was interesting book of his poetry, which is called concrete poetry, abstract poetry. It's called Anti-Codes, Antikony. And so he started with this dissection of language, with this examination of language. And I think once you start discussing language, which is supposed to be, like we said, a carrier of meaning, of something what we live through, because we live with language, and language is basically everything we have to express ourselves. And he was basically studying this, how language is becoming less and less meaningful and more meaningless, devoid of meaning. And in these poems you can see that. I think that's where also politics come into play. Once you start to subvert this essential tool you have, and it's becoming less human, and you become less human, I think it's a big political topic.
One of his earliest jobs at Divadana Zagreb was to write some extra speeches for a production that Grossman was putting together, or had put together, of poetry. The poetry was some of the most beautiful poetry in the Czech language, some of the greatest poets. And Havel wrote some speeches in current political jargon, which contrasted with those.
Exactly.
And then soon after that came the Garden Party, where you got the character Hugo, who really has no voice at all. He's a nobody, he's a nothing. And he advances from his parents' use of wise-sounding proverbs through hardline standard Marxist language, through to the new liberal, humane type of language, and until he gets to the top and finds himself, I can't remember if he's liquidating the Inauguration Bureau or the other way around.
That's right, yeah.
You're right, it is the exercise of power through language.
And I don't know if it was his favorite topic. It was the topic which probably chose him, right? It's like when you read all these plays, audience, but more in protest, but very much in Largo de Solato, when the responsibility is being delegated onto a so-called dissident, a savior of our society, right? A person who speaks for us. Then he became a president again, so it was being chosen for him, I think, right? I don't know if it can be a favorite topic for somebody. I think it's difficult to have a favorite topic and having it as politics. It's just something what was probably very personal to him. Right? Actually, this play is dedicated to Alfred Raga, who was who was supposed to direct this play in Vienna in 1976, but unfortunately he died right upon his arrival to Vienna on heart attack. And it's with Otomara Krejča, probably one of the greatest, and Jan Grossman, one of the greatest Czech directors of 20th century. And he, in his work, was very much interested in power, mechanisms of power, control, surveillance, manipulation. So these were the talks which were not only related to Havel. There was something in the air, and at least these two extraordinary artists were looking at it from different perspectives. Havel as a playwright, a man of literature, and Radok as a director who never actually wrote anything. He was expressing himself through the theater language. So, yeah, it was. Yeah.
I was just going to add that in a totalitarian system, you can't be non-political. Just simply being independent is enough to make you viewed as being political by the regime. The obvious example is the plastic people, the what's the technical term for the plastic people? What kind of music?
It's hard to say.
Let's call them rock music. But who were persecuted by the regime simply because they wanted to play music, not because it was a protest movement, music who would have been in the West.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, basically any activity, even though it was not political, became political. And especially in the theater, there's so many stories about metaphors which just occurred, even though they were not intended to be metaphors, etc., etc. at the time of communist regime. That's right.
One discovery I made quite recently, it's not a particular discovery, that one of the actors in Havel's company, in the Balustrades company, his father had been on trial with Milada Horáková,
Right.
and been given a life sentence, and was actually released very shortly before this period, I think around about 1963 or 64.
Mm-hmm.
So you realise how close politics were to really everyone. In Britain, I find you can live a life completely indifferent to politics, and I guess it's possible now in this Czech Republic as it is in the present age. But you were never away from politics. It was something that you lived with, woke up with, worried about when your children were going to school, worried about what the children were going to say at school. Your personnel file, which in the West a personnel file would just contain information about your employment and matters relevant to that. But a personnel file would contain details of which relations had gone abroad, whether anyone in your family went to church. It was all so personal and so close that I think once people began to write more freely in the 1960s, and in fiction you had people like Kundera also wrote plays, he wrote for the theatre, that it was part of the very close bond between people and the arts and culture generally, much more so than we knew it in the West.
Related to that, I'm going back kind of also to a comment you made earlier. You said Havel wanted this place to be more universal. Is that correct? You know, and stand the test of time. Do you think, though, it's entirely possible to separate his plays nowadays from what he was writing about? You know, he was political, like you said, you know, because he kind of had to be at the time. But do you think today's audience can watch it with a neutral eye, not thinking, you know, oh, he was writing in a time of communism in the Czech Republic? You know, is that pursued? Is that, you know, emphasized, or is it often looked upon historically?
Well, as I said earlier, it's legitimate to try and stage a play in a different environment, in a different time and place. But I think one gets the truth of Havel's plays by setting them in the actual time that they took place, because they do have universal truths in them. But I think, given the time when they were written, that has to be seen in context. I'm trying to remember the productions I saw in Britain now. And I mentioned the unpredictability of the audiences. I think it is by putting them in their time that you can really see what they are properly about.
This is a very good question, I think, that, and I'm always interested in one particular point of that question. Is Havel staged abroad because his plays are written by Václav Havel, or because the plays are so interesting for us, for our audience, that we need to discuss our topics through them? That's the most important thing. And at the conference I mentioned, I think both parts are always in play. Right? We had a person from Croatia, and when they were playing Havel, you were 100% sure that it's exactly a must. It's a need for them to discuss their issues, their political situation in the 60s and later on. And Havel was there, not an interesting dissident, a person persecuted in his own country, etc., etc. But on the other hand, we had some reports on shows, for instance, in Scandinavia, Finland, Norway. And from that, and the presenter, the speaker, acknowledged that. She said that, yes, they staged it because it was a part of solidarity with a persecuted dissident. So that's one thing. The other thing is that you need to pick a play, because still there is a difference between Havel in the early 1960s, his Garden Party or the Memo, his plays from the 70s, and then from the 1980s. I think the plays from the 1960s, especially the Garden Party or the Memo, are still very relevant nowadays, because we still have, since the time of Karl Kraus, who wrote that the totality of a phrase is the totality we always have, and it's always here. We have to get rid of it. And I think that Havel was also doing something like that. He was offering this diagnosis of the totality of a phrase, something, a shibboleth, something what is devoid of meaning. That you see. And our politicians, I think politicians here in the West, anywhere in the world, are masters of phrases. Right? They use language just as a marketing tool to sell themselves, to be voted. Right? They don't really care for you, do they? So I think this is very relevant. Right? If without the locale, without having that situation, But honestly, I hate having footnotes with plays I'm going to watch in theater. I don't need to know who is who is koho. Why would I have to know? Right? I'm not going to do my homework before I go to theater. Why would I do that? Right? As a spectator, sure, if you want to, it's perfect. So that's just my answer to it. Right? I don't think that audience is always more clever than what's going on the stage. If it's not like that, there's certain arrogance to it, I think, right? So, yeah, just what you pick from Havel. I think relevant plays are, for instance, these ones, right? Or it depends on the situation in which you live, right? Maybe Havel will become again, unfortunately, so topical.
I also find that you get much more from Havel by seeing him on stage than reading. I read The Beggar's Opera and thought, how different is it from the original one? But then I saw it on stage, and the whole political significance just... And the fun and the humour and the jokes.
Yeah. Well, Beggar's Opera, I think, is however, slightly different play to the rest of this plays. First of all, it's an adaptation of John Gay's play. And what is interesting also, we had this, it might be of your interest too, I don't know. We had, along with the conference we had, we also opened an exhibition of Václav Havel's, or set designs of Václav Havel's plays. And what we found is that it's quite tricky with set design with Havel. What does he need, right? From a set design, right? Look at this. Right? We're basically audience. I'm a brewmaster, uneducated idiot, and here's an intellectual, and that's all you need, right? Not much. You cannot do really a lot. But, and I agree with Barbara, and I think it's so hard to find it. The best production I've seen of Havel's plays was Largo Desolato, Divadlo na Zábradlí, Theatre on the Balustrades. And I think that it was because, well, Grossman did it his way in the first place. And the second, there was a great set design. And in that set design, with so many doors, and with the big chandelier, the topic was transferred. The topic was there in the theatrical language. And I think it's so hard, because once you have a theater play which is so much based on language, that if you deteriorate that, you should walk away from it, I think, because you have to, if you play Garden Party, you cut it, and it's impossible, right? So as a theater practitioner, you have to deal with that topic, I think, that it's so dominant. It's a dominant element of the whole show. And Grossman, in this particular production of Largo Desolato by Bartoška, I think he changed it into theater, that the literary artifact became theatrical artifact. But I think it's quite hard with Havel's plays, actually. I don't know.
I've seen several of them done in a theatre in the round, which is very interesting because you feel Havel is always writing for a proscenium, a conventional stage. And to twist them round, to put them in the middle with the audience round, it brings something different that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. I remember the Temptation was produced at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in around about the late 1980s. And the director came over to talk to Havel about it beforehand. But what he never told Havel was that it was going to be done in the round. I don't know what his reaction was, because then they brought the video, smuggled it back in for him to see.
He was disappointed.
I've no idea. Maybe he was thrilled.
Oh, maybe.
I don't know what his reaction was.
Yeah. It's almost 9 o'clock. So if you have any more questions, please ask us, or I think it's about time.
Perhaps last question.
Perhaps last question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Very short one. Very short one. Which other Havel's play would you recommend to these young people that is translated into English? So if this play was interesting for them, and anything else that they could
My
read.
recommendation.
Yes.
Barbara, you said that your favorite is Memorandum.
Yes, I mean, maybe first audience as a starter play, but if they're moving on to the full-length plays, I think the Memorandum, because it has this wonderful device of the TDP language, and it also has a structure that you can actually follow the spiral effect. There are 3 different sets. There's the manager's office, the translation department, and the classroom, and it revolves, and you can see how it revolves downwards. There's a downward spiral in the first half and an upward spiral in the second half, and you can trace it very, very, very clearly. Sorry, I'll keep my answer short. I promise.
Yeah, my favorite place is Garden Party and Largo Desolato. These are the plays I would recommend. But it's also interesting to read his first play and his very last play, to compare. But nothing much changed in terms of system.
There are quite a few lesser-known plays interspersed. There's Hotel, Mountain Hotel.
That's also pretty nice.
And there's the very little play that he wrote for Samuel Beckett, I think, called Mistake.
Mistake, that's right.
So there is still more to discover.
Or if you're interested in Temptation, Barbara mentioned Temptation, it's a variation of the Faustian myth. So you have a modern Faust in Havel's variation. Quite an interesting play too. And again, the motive of collaboration is there. Well, of course, it's Faust. Faust is about collaboration, with a contract with the devil. Okay, I think that it's about time. It was last question. Thank you for that. Thank you, Barbara.